22nd November 1942, Kalach on the Don, Soviet Union. Lieutenant Hans Weber of the German 16th Panzer Division stood in the freezing dawn, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the western horizon where the Don River crossings should have been their lifeline to safety. Behind him, 40 kilometers to the east, Stalingrad still smoldered, a city his division had been fighting to capture for 3 brutal months. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius overnight, and a thin layer of frost covered everything. Then he saw them. Emerging from the morning mist like steel phantoms, dozens of Soviet T-34 tanks advancing from the west, not the east, from behind German lines. His hands began to tremble, and not from the cold. The tanks weren't coming from Stalingrad. They were coming from the rear, which meant only one thing: encirclement. In that moment of dawning horror, Weber understood that his division, along with the entire German Sixth Army, was now trapped. Over 290,000 men, Germany's finest soldiers, cut off deep in enemy territory as winter closed in. The mistake Hitler had made wasn't just tactical or operational, it was existential, and it would cost Germany everything. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you realized your entire army was surrounded? To understand Hitler's biggest mistake, we must first understand why the German Sixth Army was in Stalingrad at all. By summer 1942, Nazi Germany had conquered most of continental Europe, but Hitler's war machine faced a critical vulnerability: oil. Germany's mechanized forces consumed petroleum at rates the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești could barely sustain. Without additional oil, the panzers would stop rolling, the Luftwaffe would be grounded, and the Kriegsmarine would remain in port. Hitler's gaze turned toward the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, Baku, Grozny, and Maikop, which together produced over 80% of Soviet petroleum. Operation Blue, launched on 28 June 1942, was designed to capture these fields and simultaneously destroy Soviet capacity to wage mechanized warfare. Army Group South split into 2 thrusts. Army Group A would drive into the Caucasus toward the oil fields, while Army Group B, spearheaded by General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army, would secure the Don River bend and capture Stalingrad. But here was Hitler's first mistake, actually his first of many that would compound into catastrophe. Stalingrad was initially a secondary objective, meant to protect the northern flank of the Caucasus operation. It was an industrial city, yes, home to the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, converted to produce T-34 tanks, the Barakati gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. Capturing it would sever the Volga River, a critical Soviet supply artery. Militarily sound objectives. But then came the fatal element: symbolism. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. In Hitler's mind, increasingly dominated by personal rivalry and ideological obsession, capturing the city became about humiliating his Soviet counterpart. What had been a tactical objective transformed into an all-consuming fixation. Hitler began diverting resources from Army Group A's oil field operation to support the Stalingrad assault. The strategic objective, oil, became subordinate to the symbolic objective, a city with Stalin's name. General Paulus's Sixth Army was one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations. 270,000 men, organized into 22 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions and 3 motorized divisions. These were veterans who had fought through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. They possessed excellent equipment: Panzer IV tanks with upgraded 75mm guns, Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, and ample artillery. General Paulus's Sixth Army was one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations. 270,000 men organized into 22 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions and 3 motorized divisions. These were veterans who had fought through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. They possessed excellent equipment: Panzer IV tanks with upgraded 75mm guns, Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, and ample artillery support. By mid-August, advance units reached Stalingrad outskirts. On 23 August 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a devastating assault. Over 600 aircraft dropping thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries. Oil storage tanks erupted in towering flames. Over 40,000 civilians died in a single afternoon. German commanders, viewing the burning city, believed Soviet resistance was broken. They were catastrophically wrong, and this represented Hitler's second mistake, fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of urban warfare and Soviet determination. General Vasily Choikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army, had transformed the bombed city into a defensive masterpiece. His strategy was simple and brilliant: hug the Germans close. Fight them at such intimate range that German artillery and air power became useless. What followed was Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. Every building became a fortress. Every pile of rubble concealed firing positions. Combat occurred simultaneously in sewers, basements, ground floors, upper stories, and rooftops. The central railway station changed hands 15 times in a single day on 14 September. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov's garrison held a single 4-story apartment building for 58 days against repeated German assaults. More Germans died trying to take that building than died taking Paris. German casualties mounted horrifically. By early November, the Sixth Army had lost over 50,000 men, dead or wounded, in 3 months of urban combat. Replacements arrived poorly trained and were thrown immediately into the meat grinder. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies, found its effectiveness drastically reduced bombing rubble. And still, Hitler ordered, "Press the attack, capture every block. Stalingrad must fall before winter." This was Hitler's third and tactical inflexibility combined with strategic blindness. Military logic dictated that once urban warfare bogged down with unacceptable casualties, objectives should be reassessed. But Hitler had staked his prestige on Stalingrad. Retreat or diversion was psychologically impossible for him. So the Sixth Army continued grinding itself down in the ruins, while Hitler ignored increasingly desperate warnings from his generals about vulnerable flanks. By mid-November, the Sixth Army controlled 90% of Stalingrad, but it was exhausted, under strength, and its flanks, stretching hundreds of miles along the Don River, were held not by German troops, but by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. These satellite forces were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and lacked sufficient anti-tank weapons. German intelligence repeatedly warned that these flanks were vulnerable to Soviet counterattack. Hitler dismissed the warnings. He was fixated on capturing that last 10% of Stalingrad. This was Hitler's fourth and most catastrophic mistake, ignoring intelligence about Soviet preparations for Operation Uranus. While German attention remained locked on Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet High Command had assembled over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft north and south of the German salient. The trap was set. Hitler either didn't see it or didn't believe it mattered. On 19 November 1942, the trap sprang shut. At 0730 hours on 19 November, Soviet artillery erupted along an 80-mile front held primarily by the Romanian Third Army. Over 3,500 guns fired in concentrated fury, a barrage lasting 80 minutes that obliterated defensive positions, severed communications, and buried command posts. Romanian soldiers in inadequate bunkers experienced an apocalypse. Then came the tanks, hundreds of T-34s and T-70s surging through fog and snow. The Romanian front collapsed within hours. Some units fought bravely but were overwhelmed. Others surrendered or fled. By nightfall on 19th November, Soviet mechanized columns had penetrated 50 kilometers behind German lines, racing westward toward the Don River crossings. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer struck. Again, devastating artillery preceded armored exploitation. The Romanian Fourth Army disintegrated. German reserves rushed to plug gaps, but there were too few reserves. They'd all been fed into Stalingrad's ruins. On 23 November, at approximately 1600 hours, Soviet forces met near Kalach on the Don. The ring closed. Inside, the entire Sixth Army, 290,000 men, plus supporting units, the largest operational encirclement in military history. And here we arrive at Hitler's fifth and most incomprehensible mistake, the decision that truly cost him everything, refusing to authorize an immediate breakout. General Paulus sent an urgent message to Army Group headquarters within hours of encirclement. Request permission to break out westward. His staff calculated they had perhaps 72 hours before Soviet forces consolidated positions. A fighting breakout, abandoning heavy equipment and wounded who couldn't travel, could save 200,000 men. Every hour of delay meant death for thousands. Hitler's response came swiftly. Hold at Stalingrad. Form hedgehog defense. Supplies will be delivered by air. Do not retreat. This decision, this single order, was Hitler's biggest mistake. It was militarily indefensible, logistically impossible, and strategically catastrophic. Let's understand why. First, the airlift was a fantasy. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, desperate to maintain Hitler's favor and addicted to morphine, promised the Luftwaffe could deliver 750 tons of supplies daily to the pocket. The Sixth Army required exactly that, 750 tons per day of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, just to survive as a fighting force. Göring's promise was based on nothing, not aircraft availability, not weather conditions, not enemy interference. It was a delusion, and many Luftwaffe officers knew it immediately. The primary transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju-52, was a slow, lumbering tri-motor from the 1930s, defenseless, vulnerable, and inadequate for sustained operations in Russian winter. The pocket had only makeshift airstrips that deteriorated rapidly. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft artillery controlled the airspace. Blizzards grounded squadrons for days. The airlift never delivered more than 300 tons in a single day, less than half the minimum requirement. Most days far less arrived. Wounded couldn't be evacuated. Supplies dwindled. Starvation began. Second, holding the pocket served no military purpose. Hitler claimed the Sixth Army would tie down Soviet forces, but this was backwards logic. The Sixth Army wasn't tying down Soviet forces, it was tied down itself, unable to maneuver, unable to threaten Soviet operations elsewhere, slowly dying in place. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were free to launch offensives elsewhere that threatened the entire southern front. Third, and most critically, the decision revealed Hitler's complete disconnect from military reality. Every senior commander who studied the situation, Paulus, Manstein, Zeitzler understood that holding the pocket was suicide, but Hitler had convinced himself that willpower alone could overcome logistics, weather, and mathematics. He had done it before, hadn't he? His stand fast orders during the winter crisis of 1941-42 outside Moscow had arguably prevented a rout. But that situation was fundamentally different. Those troops weren't encircled, weren't cut off from supply, weren't facing the annihilation of an entire army. Hitler's sixth mistake was psychological. He could not admit error. Authorizing the breakout would mean admitting that Stalingrad had been a mistake, that 3 months of fighting had been for nothing, that his strategic vision had failed. His entire political career had been built on the mythology of his infallible will. He literally could not bring himself to give the order that would save 200,000 men, because it would mean admitting he'd been wrong. One German staff officer later wrote, "The moment Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold, we knew they were doomed. He sacrificed an entire army, Germany's finest, to preserve his own mythology. It wasn't strategy, it was ego masked as determination." Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the Kessel, Hitler's mistakes transformed into human suffering on an apocalyptic scale. The airlift's failure became apparent within days. Rations were cut repeatedly. By early December, German soldiers received 200 grams of bread per day, about 2 slices, supplemented by watery soup. Horses were slaughtered and eaten. When the horses were gone, men boiled leather belts. Starvation claimed lives daily. The cold was merciless. Temperatures dropped to -30°C and below. German soldiers, most lacking adequate winter clothing, suffered mass frostbite casualties. Entire companies became combat ineffective from cold injury alone. Fingers and toes blackened and required amputation, often without anesthesia, as medical supplies vanished. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery ravaged weakened bodies. Typhus, carried by lice infesting every uniform, appeared and spread through overcrowded bunkers. Without adequate medical supplies, treatment was impossible. Wounded lay in frozen cellars, their groans falling silent as they died. And still, Hitler refused to authorize breakout. His seventh mistake was continuing this refusal even when a brief window reopened. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm on 12 December, a relief operation with the 4th Panzer Army driving northeast toward the pocket. By 19th December, advance units had closed to within 35 miles of the pocket perimeter. German soldiers inside could hear distant artillery and dared to hope. This was the moment. Paulus requested permission to launch Operation Thunderclap, a simultaneous breakout toward Manstein's force. Combined, they might save 200,000 men, but it required abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning heavy equipment, abandoning Hitler's symbolic objective. Hitler refused. Hold Stalingrad. The Sixth Army would wait for complete relief, maintain positions. The moment passed. Soviet counteroffensives threatened to encircle Manstein's force. Winter Storm collapsed. The relief column retreated. By Christmas, hope died in the pocket. Hitler's eighth mistake was compounding the disaster with meaningless symbolism. On 30th January 1943, he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the Wehrmacht. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus was expected to commit suicide, providing a dramatic martyrdom for propaganda. But Paulus refused. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed his headquarters. Paulus, emaciated and lice-ridden, surrendered the southern pocket. The northern group fought until 2nd February before laying down arms. Of 290,000 men encircled in November, approximately 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity, barely alive, most weighing less than 50 kilograms. Only about 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The remainder, nearly 200,000 men, died in the pocket from combat, starvation, disease, or cold. An entire army had been annihilated because one man refused to admit he'd made a mistake. Hitler's mistakes at Stalingrad cost Germany far more than 290,000 soldiers. The strategic, psychological, and material consequences reverberated throughout the rest of the war and ensured Germany's eventual defeat. First, the immediate military impact. The Sixth Army had been one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations. 22 divisions, the equivalent of the entire force that invaded France in 1940, simply ceased to exist. Gone were experienced officers who had commanded since Poland, NCOs who had survived 3 years of combat, specialists and veterans who formed the Wehrmacht's institutional backbone. These men could not be replaced. Divisions could be rebuilt on paper, but the human expertise was gone forever. Second, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Before Stalingrad, Germany could still choose when and where to attack. After Stalingrad, that choice belonged to the Red Army. Soviet offensives throughout 1943 and 1944, at Kursk, across Ukraine, through Belarus, drove the Wehrmacht westward in a retreat that would end only in Berlin. Germany would never again launch a major offensive that achieved strategic objectives in the East. Third, the psychological impact was devastating. The myth of German invincibility shattered. Throughout occupied Europe, resistance movements took heart. Germany could be beaten. In London and Washington, Allied strategists recognized that the Soviet Union would not collapse and could systematically destroy German armies. German soldiers throughout the Wehrmacht began questioning whether victory was possible. Morale, already strained, began its terminal decline. Fourth, Germany's allies lost faith. Romania, Hungary, and Italy had all lost divisions at Stalingrad. Their soldiers had been sacrificed while Hitler refused retreat. The message was clear: Germany would sacrifice anyone to maintain illusions. By 1943's end, Italy had surrendered. By 1944, Romania and Hungary were seeking exit strategies. Fifth, the material cost was staggering. Beyond the men, Germany lost hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of tons of equipment, all irreplaceable. The Wehrmacht's motorization rate, already inadequate, declined further. Units became increasingly reliant on horse-drawn transport, reducing mobility and operational flexibility. Sixth, Hitler's mistakes validated Soviet military doctrine. Trykov's urban warfare tactics, Zhukov's operational-level encirclement strategy, the concept of defense in depth, all had been proven effective against Germany's supposedly superior military machine. The Red Army gained confidence and refined these methods for subsequent battles. But perhaps most critically, Stalingrad revealed the fundamental flaw in Hitler's leadership. He prioritized ideology over reality, symbolism over strategy, and his own ego over the lives of his soldiers. This pattern, visible at Stalingrad, would repeat throughout the rest of the war. Dunkirk, where Hitler halted panzers and allowed the British Expeditionary Force to escape. The Battle of Britain continued long after it was unwinnable. Declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. Refusing to authorize strategic withdrawals on the Eastern Front. squandering resources on V-weapons rather than fighters to defend German cities. Every decision followed the same pattern. Ideology trumped military logic. One German general who survived the war wrote, "Stalingrad was where we lost the war, not because the Soviet Union was stronger, though it was, but because Hitler revealed himself incapable of rational military command." After Stalingrad, every thinking officer knew we were serving a commander who would sacrifice any number of soldiers rather than admit error. That knowledge poisoned everything that followed. To truly understand Hitler's biggest mistake, consider the alternative timeline. What would have happened if Hitler had authorized the breakout on 24 November 1942, 72 hours after encirclement? The Sixth Army, at that moment, still possessed significant combat power, approximately 250,000 effective soldiers, the rest already casualties or non-combatants, operational tanks and artillery, adequate fuel and ammunition for a week of intense combat, and high morale before starvation and cold set in. The Soviet encirclement ring was not yet fully consolidated. Gaps existed, anti-tank defenses were incomplete, and Soviet forces were extended after their rapid advance. Military analysts have wargamed this scenario extensively. The consensus, a fighting breakout on 24 to 26 November could have saved 150,000 to 200,000 men. Casualties would have been heavy, perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 killed or captured during the breakout itself. All heavy equipment would have been lost, tanks, artillery, vehicles. The breakout would have been a desperate, chaotic operation through winter conditions against determined opposition. But 150,000 to 200,000 German soldiers would have escaped. These men would have been available for subsequent operations. The Sixth Army, though mauled, could have been reconstituted. The experienced cadre of officers and NCOs would have survived to lead new formations. Moreover, authorizing the breakout would have freed Army Group A in the Caucasus to conduct a more orderly withdrawal, potentially saving additional forces from encirclement. The Southern Front, though contracted, would have stabilized at defensible positions. Germany would have lost the symbolic prize of Stalingrad, but preserved military capability. The strategic impact would have been profound. With an additional 150,000 to 200,000 veterans, Germany could have 1. Contested Soviet offensives in early 1943 more effectively, 2. Potentially made the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 more than a desperate gamble, 3. Delayed Soviet advances across Ukraine and Belarus, 4. Maintained defensive depth in the east, trading space for time. Would this have changed the war's ultimate outcome? Almost certainly not. Germany was fighting enemies with overwhelming material superiority. The Soviet Union's vast manpower and resources, American industrial might, British determination. Strategic defeat was likely inevitable once Germany failed to knock the Soviet Union out in 1941. But the war might have lasted longer. Soviet advances might have been slower. Casualties on all sides would have been different. The final battles in Germany might have played out differently. The preservation of 150,000 experienced soldiers was not trivial. It represented significant military capability in a war where Germany was bleeding irreplaceable human capital. More critically, authorizing the breakout would have signaled rational military command. It would have told the Wehrmacht that strategic flexibility was acceptable, that tactical defeats could be acknowledged without catastrophic consequences, that preserving combat power mattered more than symbolic objectives. This might have created a military culture where subsequent strategic retreats were authorized earlier,
saving additional forces and prolonging German defensive capabilities.
But Hitler could not do it. His psychology, his ideology, his political mythology, all combined to make the rational decision impossible. And so, 290,000 men died. An entire army was annihilated, and Germany's path to defeat accelerated. Beyond statistics and strategy, Hitler's mistakes at Stalingrad had intensely personal costs. 290,000 individual tragedies, each representing a human being who died because of decisions made hundreds of miles away. One German soldier, whose final letter was found on his frozen body, wrote to his mother, "We have been ordered to hold. We are told relief is coming, but mother, I no longer believe it. We have no food, no fuel, no hope. Yesterday Johann died, not from Russian bullets, but from simply being too weak and cold to continue. He went to sleep and never woke. I envy him. I no longer understand why we must die here. What are we holding? Ruins? For whom? Please remember me as I was." Another soldier wrote, "They tell us Germany needs us to fight to the last, but for what purpose? We cannot attack, we cannot retreat, we can only die slowly. This is not warfare, this is murder by neglect. Whoever ordered us to stay here has condemned us to death as surely as if he shot us himself." A German doctor wrote, "I am no longer a physician, I have become a witness to mass death. I amputate frozen limbs without morphine because we have none. Men scream, but what else can I do? Most will die anyway from infection or weakness. We have no food, no medicine, no heat. I record their names when possible so someone might inform their families, but mostly I just watch them die." These voices, and hundreds of thousands like them, represent the human cost of Hitler's mistakes. These were not abstractions or chess pieces, but individuals with families, dreams, and the right to competent leadership that valued their lives. Soviet defenders paid a terrible price as well, over 1 million casualties defending Stalingrad, but they fought for survival, for their homeland, for the right to exist. German soldiers died for a symbolic objective that served no military purpose, ordered to their deaths by a commander who refused to admit error. The moral weight of this distinction matters. Soldiers who die in necessary defensive battles or in offensive operations with clear strategic objectives can at least be said to have died for purpose. The German soldiers at Stalingrad died for Hitler's ego. That is the tragedy within the tragedy. Hitler's biggest mistake at Stalingrad was not a single decision, but a cascade of errors, each compounding the last, each rooted in fundamental flaws of character and ideology. The mistake of obsession, prioritizing a symbolic objective over strategic sense. The mistake of inflexibility, refusing to adapt when circumstances changed. The mistake of denial, ignoring intelligence about Soviet preparations. The mistake of fantasy, believing logistics could be overcome by will. The mistake of stubbornness, refusing to authorize breakout when it was still possible. The mistake of continued stubbornness, refusing even when a relief force approached. The mistake of ego, valuing personal mythology over soldiers' lives. The mistake of delusional symbolism, promoting Paulus to field marshal rather than ordering evacuation. Each mistake alone would have been serious. Combined, they created catastrophe. And the pattern revealed at Stalingrad, ideology over reality, symbolism over strategy, ego over competence, would characterize Hitler's leadership for the remainder of the war. In that freezing dawn of 22nd November, when Lieutenant Hans Weber saw Soviet tanks approaching from behind German lines, he witnessed the beginning of the end. The trap had closed. And Hitler's refusal to let the Sixth Army escape would cost Germany not just 290,000 soldiers, but any realistic chance of winning the war in the East. The soldiers who died in Stalingrad deserved better. They deserved a commander who valued their lives above symbolism. They deserved strategic flexibility that acknowledged when objectives had become untenable. They deserved the chance to survive and fight another day. Instead, they received orders to stand and die while their supreme commander, warm and well-fed hundreds of miles away, refused to admit his strategy had failed. That was Hitler's biggest mistake, and it cost him everything: his army, his strategic initiative, his allies' confidence, his soldiers' morale, and ultimately the war itself. On that November morning when the Soviet pincers met at Kalach and sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, Hitler was given a choice. He could authorize an immediate breakout, lose Stalingrad but save 200,000 men, or he could hold for symbolic purposes and lose everything. He chose symbolism. He chose ego. He chose ideology over soldiers' lives. And so 290,000 men died, frozen, starved, or shot, in ruins that had ceased to have any military value. An entire army vanished into the Russian winter because one man could not admit he'd made a mistake. Stalingrad was where Hitler's biggest mistake destroyed his finest army, shattered German confidence, and ensured the Third Reich's eventual collapse. Every subsequent German defeat, from Kursk to Normandy to Berlin, traced its origins to that moment when 290,000 soldiers were sacrificed to preserve one man's mythology. The men who died in Stalingrad deserved to be remembered not as propaganda symbols, but as victims of catastrophic leadership. They deserved better to die for a mistake that should never have been made, prolonged by stubbornness that should never have been tolerated, in service of a regime that valued ideology over human life. But while Germany's fortunes collapsed in the East, Allied forces were preparing operations that would open new fronts and accelerate the Third Reich's destruction. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, where American, British, and Canadian forces launched the largest amphibious operation before D-Day and began the liberation of Fortress Europe from the south.